Okay.
Okay, I believe we are now recording.
Very good. Very good. Friends, why don't we begin our time in prayer? Almighty and holy God, we give you thanks for this new day and this time to be together with other pilgrims on the journey of life. Down through the ages, oh God, you have reminded us time and time again that all of us are pilgrims, all of us are wanderers, that we have in our own past personal experiences of immigration. And so, as we gather together now in our contemporary context, we ask that you would open our hearts to our neighbors, especially to our neighbors who are vulnerable in some way, our neighbors who are suffering in some way. And we ask that you would guide us with your spirit of justice, with your spirit of mercy, with your spirit of righteousness, with your spirit of compassion. We give you thanks and praise for Erin and for her organization and for the important work that they are doing. We give you thanks for Lewinsville Presbyterian and its ongoing desire to follow you in all spheres of our lives. Bless our time today. Bless what we hear. Bless what we say. Bless what we think and reflect. Use this time for your glory. We pray in the name of Jesus Christ, whom we are following. Amen.
Amen. So we are welcoming this morning Erin McKinney, who is the Executive Director of Just Neighbors. This is an organization that was founded in 1996 by pastors and attorneys of the United Methodist Church to develop a practical response to the legal challenges that low-income immigrants face in the United States. Just Neighbors offers immigration legal services to low-income immigrants and refugees in Washington, D.C., Maryland, and Virginia. Erin is a native of Kentucky and a graduate of Georgetown College in Kentucky, and she has lived in Northern Virginia since 1985 and is a member of Annandale United Methodist Church. And she has traveled extensively on their mission trips and I believe also on her own, and that has helped provide her context for the work she does here with people who have come relatively recently to Northern Virginia. So welcome, Erin, and thank you very much for being with us. We're looking forward to your talk. And you need to unmute, yeah.
It's not a Zoom call unless somebody has to be reminded to unmute. It's guaranteed. Yeah, it's interesting to be back in kind of doing more presentations since the pandemic. You know, we were doing a lot of these in person prior to the pandemic, and for the last year, it kind of stopped for a long time and has slowly started to step back up as people are looking for any items of interesting content after being locked down for so long. So I really appreciate the opportunity to speak with you all. Thank you, Rosalind, for making the connection here. You know, one of the things as a faith community, if we think biblically about immigration, and Reverend Scott, your prayer very much touched on that. The Bible is very much a book about immigration, if you think about it, from Adam and Eve being forced out of the garden, Abraham certainly, and even Jesus as a child forced to flee from Herod. These are stories that parallel what's going on in our world today very, very much. And the Bible's very clear on how we treat aliens as one of us and to take care of them. So that's really, I think, a very much an underlying focus of the mission of and the ministry of Just Neighbors since its founding. And as Kathy mentioned, we were founded in the basement of a Methodist church and have grown from that. And I'll talk more about that as we get started here. I'm going to share my screen and put up a presentation. And I'm going to start with a brief video. Hopefully. We tested this just a minute ago. There we go.
Just Neighbors is an immigration legal service provider that serves low-income immigrants throughout Virginia. We take all kinds of cases, so we work with asylees, refugees, adjustment of status, VAWA, which is under the Violence Against Women Act, U visas, and numerous humanitarian type cases. I think what has impacted me most is being able to see clients from the very beginning to the very end, and to see them in just utter hopelessness, and be able to, through years of experience, encourage them that there is another side.
As a former client, every day I wake up with a new sense of security and hope. When I came through the doors of Just Neighbors, my family and I had gone through probably the worst painful experience anyone should have to go through, and we were treated with respect, with care, with compassion, and the expertise needed to get through a fairly complex case. Nothing will ever beat the call that I got when Dominique, who was the lawyer that...
Oh no, technical glitch on my side, sorry.
Helped. My family called and said, Rodrigo, I have your green card. It's in the office. You've been approved. You are now a permanent resident of the United States.
So this is always the challenge of transitioning from
that face that is usually covered by her.
Are you seeing the slideshow?
Yes.
Okay. There we go. There we go. Okay. It's a little weird because I can't see you all I can see is the presentation. So that gave you a little bit of an overview of who we are. We serve only those who are below 200% of poverty level. And that means this year, the numbers are for a family of four, just around $50,000 a year. And that was from the beginning of the construct of the organization, because folks in that income level can not really afford private attorneys to help facilitate them through the pathway to file for their immigration status. What we see today is private attorneys charging anywhere from $3,000 to $10,000 per case, depending on the type of case, if there's even private attorneys available. And when you get into, particularly in the more rural areas like the Eastern Shore of Virginia, there are no immigration attorneys, public, private, or nonprofit on the Eastern Shore. So for us to be able to go there and do clinics or serve clients remotely for $100 or $200 is huge. And what we find it in Northern Virginia and the Washington metropolitan area as well, but many are so desperate for the legal help that they're often victims of notorious fraud. People promising them things, A, they can't deliver or don't know how to deliver, or just purely taking their money, promising something. And we see a large percentage of this population are often victims of that. So our primary mission is to provide the direct legal services. And that is actually helping people apply for their immigration status, renewing that status, moving through the different statuses, which I'll talk about a little bit more. But we also engage in education. We, particularly the last 4 or 5 years, there's been so much rhetoric about immigration. And what we had developed a presentation internally for staff and volunteers, just as a baseline understanding of immigration. And we've actually started taking that presentation out to folks. And I certainly would extend this to you. And I'll show you a little, very brief snippet of it. The attorneys do the presentation normally. It's really a great overview of immigration law as a whole, particularly focused on the humanitarian pieces. And you really start to understand the levels of complexity around immigration law. We also do Know Your Rights, which is really targeted at clients, because whether they're documented or not, they do have rights. And it's really just educational for them to help them understand what to do if ICE comes, what they should and what they should not do, and really just try to, in many cases, clients do not have a pathway to any form of documentation. And so we inform them of the rights that they do have. But we cannot create a pathway for someone who does not have one through the legal system. So we're happy to do educational programs as well. We also are, part of our mission since day one is to really kind of build that connection to the immigrant population and basically to folks in the pews. We don't always have a lot of interaction with folks outside of our kind of socioeconomic groups or people who look like us. And one of the ways we've tried to help engage that is through volunteers. And it has certainly supplemented our work extensively. And like, as I mentioned, beginning of the call, we're greatly missing a lot of our volunteers. But that's also been a way to connect people so that as a volunteer, you're talking firsthand with many of our clients and hearing their stories firsthand, and it makes it very real. So it really helps people have a different perspective than just hearing me tell you a story. And the last part of our mission is really advocacy. And we're not out doing community organizing type of things, but we advocate on a local and state level around issues that impact our clients. So we have been involved in the state driver's license and in-state tuition issues. And of course, on a federal level, which is where all the immigration law is, we do work with our congressional representatives to advocate for what we believe are fair and just immigration laws. We serve, this is just the Virginia map, but we serve technically all of Virginia, Maryland, and DC. The highlighted areas here in red and blue, the blue is our original area. About a year and a half ago, we began expanding into the parts of the red footprint on this map with a grant to serve in rural areas. And as I mentioned, the Eastern Shore, which it looks like the crab claw on the right, and down the I-81 corridor, there is, and quite frankly, in the state of Virginia, outside of Richmond, Charlottesville, and Northern Virginia, there is little to no immigration legal services. So we have started to expand our ability to serve clients there. The pandemic has taught us that we can do a lot of this remotely. And we had started doing that some prior to the pandemic with our remote clients, with our rural clients. We've been doing it almost exclusively with all of our clients for the last year. So we're feeling much more competent in being able to do this with folks throughout our service area. What's not reflected on this map is, as of July of last year, we took over one of our affiliates. We're part of a national organization through the Methodist Church. Just Neighbors, formed almost 25 years ago, was a foundation for a national organization called National Justice for Our Neighbors, who has launched Just Neighbors-like affiliates across the country. And there's now between 18 and 20. We actually took over the Maryland, DC version of that in July and we're now serving the whole not just the metropolitan area, we're actually serving all of Maryland, all of Virginia, and DC. Our main office is in Annandale. We do have an office in Herndon. We now have an office in Warrenton and Winchester and in Rockville. So as I mentioned, the Immigration 101 presentation, this is the final slide of that. And whoever's presenting this full presentation, it's about an hour and a half long, would walk you through this in much more detail. I'm sharing this really only to highlight a couple things. If you are a citizen of the United States, this far left column is, you're proven to be a citizen because you're born in the United States, or you naturalized, or you're born outside of the United States to US citizen parents. Obviously, you can prove that through a passport, birth certificate, et cetera. So as a citizen, you have a right to work legally, to travel freely, to vote, to receive public benefits. You can sponsor immediate relatives and so forth. That's as a US citizen, and that's the goal. If you are a permanent legal resident, a lawful permanent resident, also known as green card holders. You do not have all of the rights of a US citizen. You certainly cannot vote, but it does give you many of the rights. So you can work legally, you can travel with some restrictions. One of the restrictions, for example, is you really cannot leave the country for more than 6 months at a time. You may be eligible for some public benefits, but not necessarily all. And you can sponsor spouses and children. One of the most interesting things about this presentation is when you get into some of the detail, is when we talk about family-based petitions where you're petitioning for spouses or children, the wait time can be as long as 27 or 23 years, depending on the country and depending on whether it's an immediate relative or more distant. And the preference category is parents, spouse, and children, unmarried children under 21. The next category, which has a much longer wait, is siblings or sons and daughters over 21. A married child has very little opportunity to come. So most green cards are received through what's called family-based, and that's US citizens or green card holders petitioning for the family members through those categories that I just talked about. We do a little of that, generally not purely family-based. Most of the work that we do around that is through other cases that we're working on that allow derivatives, usually immediate family, to come in. We don't usually do the extended family work. There's also employment-based green cards, and then humanitarian-based, which is what we do. And then there's also lottery, that there's an allocation of a certain number of green cards that are literally done by lottery to different countries. And it's to try to provide some balance so that all of the immigration doesn't come from the largest countries, and try to provide some equity across many countries. And so there were, in 2019, there were about 1 million green cards issued. So that's if you're not a citizen, the next best status is to be a green card holder or a lawful permanent resident. The second category is temporary resident. And those are where most people are. So DACA recipients are temporary. Temporary protected status is another category. You also have non-immigrants who are here on visas, which could be au pairs, tourists, performers, athletes. These are all temporary status and typically does not have a pathway to citizenship. So the way it can go sometimes is you can go from temporary to permanent status to citizenship. Many of these temporary statuses do not have a pathway to citizenship. DACA, TPS in particular, which are two that have been in the news a lot. There's also the humanitarian-based ways to get this. And some of these do have pathways to citizenship. So Violence Against Women's Act, which does not apply only to women, but if you are a victim of domestic violence. So one of the things that happens is you may have a US citizen or green card holder who marries someone who is not, and they are able to petition for them to get a green card. That green card is contingent on the marriage. What often happens is that green card is used as a form of control for the spouse. And there's often physical violence, but there's also often mental abuse and just complete control. And so what VAWA allows to happen is to separate that if the marriage fails and there's that dependency would be lost. It basically allows that individual who's been victimized to petition on without spouse. U visas are for victims of crime. T visas are for trafficking victims. And so there's some other statuses there. Some of these, again, have a pathway to citizenship, others do not. And then, of course, the last category that nobody wants to be in and we don't want people in is undocumented. There's about just under 11 million. Interestingly enough, most people now enter legally and overstay their visas. So they come in as tourists, they come in as workers, and they don't leave when they're supposed to, which technically makes them undocumented. Many more are doing that now than are crossing the border without inspection. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. If you're undocumented, back to temporary for a minute, what temporary status gives you is legal right to work. So you get a work permit. You can travel within the United States. You have to get permission to leave the United States and return. And it's a promise not to deport. If you break any rules, you commit a crime or whatever, that promise goes away. But by having that temporary status, you're not going to just get picked up as undocumented and be deported. If you're undocumented, you're subject to deportation at any time. You're not eligible for any public benefits. The only thing someone who's undocumented is eligible for is schooling for children and emergency medical care. Basically, that is it. So I'm just going to move through that. So if you think about the government, the legislative branch of the government makes immigration law, federal government. All immigration law is federal. The executive branch has a responsibility to implement that and to regulate it. So while the legislative branch will pass rules about the broader immigration policy and so forth, the executive branch actually implements that through the many, Department of Homeland Security, ICE, USCIS, which is Customs, Citizenship and Immigration. There's Border Patrol. There's many organizations that are part of the actual execution of those laws. And then the judicial branch, of course, interprets those. So all of them have been very active over the last several years, much less the legislative branch in terms of activity, but certainly the executive branch is, under the Trump administration, implemented many changes to what had been the interpretations of the rules. The Biden administration is making changes to those. And the judicial branch has been very involved in either saying, yes, the executive branch can or cannot do those kinds of things. So that's been kind of a daily occurrence. That goes in here. So you can kind of see under the executive branch, there's the immigration courts, visa processing, and so forth, regulating national security. So these are the roles that each of the branches play. So during the Trump administration, there were a number of controversial acts that were put into place through executive orders, and some of them met with judicial review. So one of the things that the Trump administration did was have travel bans to predominantly Muslim countries and some African countries. The Biden administration is reviewing those and has rescinded most of those, if not all. Daca, which was in place, Daca was an executive order out of the Obama administration. Quite frankly, it should have been done legislatively, which is why many protested it. It wasn't that people disagree with the concept of it, but it should have been done legislatively. However, it has been in place. When the Trump administration attempted to rescind it in 2017, they stopped it. The courts held it at bay and basically said you have to continue to renew folks who are in that status, but no new members, no new eligibility until it gets through the entire court system. In November, the Supreme Court ruled that the Trump administration did not follow the proper procedures for overturning DACA. And so initial DACAs were reinstated in December. And so we've got kind of a 3-year backlog of folks who would have been eligible in that time to apply for DACA who are now starting to apply for DACA. Again, this is an interesting area in that it really should, I think most of the controversy goes away if it can be done legislatively. This is part of the Biden immigration strategy that we'll talk more about. So again, many of these policies have been reviewed in the courts with various degrees of either approving or stopping. There's also, what also is being reviewed are changes at the border. The Biden administration has stopped, at least temporarily, construction of the wall and are looking at different technologies and so forth to protect the border. We've got a number of policies about people coming across, so they've rescinded the zero tolerance policy. And again, a lot of these policies are being reviewed. One of the things that I think everybody recognizes is that making massive changes at the border, there's a fear that there's going to be this rush to the border. And the truth be told, we don't really know what would happen. Nobody, including the Biden administration, is necessarily proposing we just open the doors and let everybody come in who wants to. There's got to be some kind of screening process. What's been very evident is that our processes are not very humane, and B, very efficient, and C, very effective. Just to put things in perspective, without immigration, the population in the United States is declining. Our death rate exceeds our birth rate. So as a country without immigration, we would be a declining population. And quite frankly, we can't afford to decline. We need new people coming into the United States to contribute to our tax base, to support all the infrastructure, and to do all of those things. But we are not doing that within the United States. New enrollments, the Migrant Protection Protocol was also known as a return to Mexico policy. And that was for people who crossed the border to apply for asylum. Historically, they had been brought in, processed, and released with court dates to pursue their asylum, released into the United States, usually wearing an ankle bracelet monitor, having to report to ICE on a regular basis and to meet their court dates. Something like 93% of people who came in that way complied with all of that. There were certainly some who did not, but the vast majority did. What changed with the Trump administration is that instead of letting them come and stay into the United States, they were sent back to wait in Mexico. So most of them are not from Mexico. They're from Guatemala and Honduras and El Salvador and Bolivia and Haiti, and many others were trying to come across the border through Mexico. But they were sent back to Mexico to wait their turn. And then, of course, when the pandemic hit, everybody was basically stopped. He has rescinded that, and the folks who have been waiting in what would really could be called nothing other than refugee camps at the border are starting to gradually be allowed in to be processed. And then he did terminate the emergency declaration and pause the construction of the border wall, as I mentioned. So those are some of the changes. He's also addressed prosecutorial discretion. And these are decisions by the government about whether to bring or how to resolve enforcement actions. And so basically law enforcement or the judiciary had been empowered to make judgments almost at a judge level without a consistent policy approach to it. So that has also been rescinded. There was a 100-day moratorium on deportations. There was pushback on that in some states. A judge actually stopped that for a brief period of time as well. And they're reviewing the enforcement policies. Again, in the Obama administration, Obama was known as the deporter in chief. He had really amped up deportations, particularly of criminals, criminals being what I would call more violent criminals, typically not for somebody who had just because they had crossed the border and had a misdemeanor, but particularly violent felons and so forth. And he deported something like 900,000 people. The Trump administration took that a step further. And basically, if you had any crime, which could be just the fact that you crossed the border, or you were drunk in public, or got caught with pot, or what we would normally think of as a non-violent offense, could get you deported. And in the Obama administration, if they had a warrant to go into an apartment to take somebody who had a felony conviction, for example, they would not pick up other people who may have not been documented. The Trump administration's enforcement was basically they would pick up anybody in that situation. So this has all been effectively stopped for the moment. They're still certainly focusing on those who are violent and terrorist suspects or anybody who's a threat to public safety. So, again, these are very difficult policies and very, this is complicated stuff. So this is being reviewed and trying to figure out what the appropriate level is. Part of the argument for not deporting somebody just because they have a minor crime is that you're separating families in many cases. And many of these families are mixed status. They may be US citizen children or a US citizen spouse, or, and that it just adds to the layers of complication in that. The administration has also posed what's called the Us Citizenship Act of 21. And this is really an attempt at comprehensive immigration reform. It creates a 3-year path to citizenship for DACA and TPS holders. Remember, I said earlier, they're temporary status and currently do not have a pathway to citizenship. An 8-year path for tax-paying undocumented people. Quite frankly, it's stunning when you look at the statistics of how much tax undocumented people pay. They do file taxes, they do pay Social Security. At one point, this has been several years, I haven't looked for a data update. At one point, undocumented people paid $15.7 billion into the Social Security system every year and are not likely to ever receive any of it. The goal is also to clear the backlogs for many of the applications, and this slowed down dramatically over the last several years. And we see the impacts of it because what used to take 6 weeks to get a response now can take 6-8 months, and in some cases years for some of these cases to be processed. One of the other issues is it provides protections for immigrant workers. It is stunning when you go to places like the Eastern Shore that have work visas for crop pickers and so forth. The quality of housing and services that are provided to them is really stunning, how bad it is and how dangerous and unhealthy it is. And you can imagine in the midst of a pandemic with these kinds of things, the living conditions are basically, it's squalor is the only way I can define it. So part of this is also to put protections in for the migrant workers. And the United States uses a ton of migrant workers throughout the country, predominantly in the farming industry, but in other interesting, like the crabbing industry. A couple of years ago, they didn't issue enough visas. They wouldn't issue enough visas that like 3 out of the 4 crab harvesting, crab picking companies on the Eastern Shore had to shut down because they couldn't get enough workers because US citizens won't do the work. Investing in technology at the border and at the ports of entry. And this is really the, I guess, philosophical argument that a physical wall won't stop people from coming. There's actually technological solutions that are much better that would be less harmful to the environment and probably less expensive to implement. Immigration court reform. Again, we have huge backlogs in the asylum arena. Some of the things that are different in immigration court than in regular court is the judges are not held to the same, they're held to a different standard than the regular judges. Immigrants, if you commit a crime in the United States, you are entitled to representation by an attorney. Folks in immigration court are not entitled. You are allowed to have an attorney, but the government does not provide you one. I'm not 100% sure if that's one of the things that's included in here. I know part of what's included in here is that children are required to have representation, and they do not always today. So if you can imagine a child in immigration court without an attorney, without an adult, this is happening. And then, part of the challenge with this is we're always going to have a problem with immigration at the border when there's problems in the countries where these folks are coming from. And for a long time, particularly in the Northern Triangle countries of Honduras, Guatemala, and El Salvador, there has been political strife, great poverty, gang pervasiveness, drug operations. Unfortunately, a lot of this is fueled by the United States. Not only, we've been sending arms to El Salvador for years. They've had natural disasters galore, and you've got these poverty-stricken countries, and folks are quite frankly desperate. And so we need to find a way to help these countries change their situation so that people are less likely to need to come in many cases. So that's also part of the proposed legislation. I'm going to stop sharing the screen so I can see your all's faces, make sure you're still awake. So that's a lot of what's going on by this administration. To be very honest, I will be highly surprised if that entire set of immigration reform gets through Congress. I think pieces could. I think the Daca TPS could. I'm not convinced there's going to be enough compromise that will allow the whole bill or close to the whole bill to go through as proposed. So I'm going to stop. And because I couldn't see your faces, if you had questions, I'd like to open it up. And if you have questions, please feel free about the organization, about immigration as a whole, whatever.
And I think we're a small enough group that you can probably just sort of unmute yourself and talk and be mindful of whether somebody else is trying to be talked. So feel free.
Mary?
Yes, I'd like to talk a little bit more about actually what you do in your office and the kinds of cases and outcomes.
Happy to. So we do humanitarian based, and that includes, we do Daca, both initial and renewals. So does everybody know what Daca is? Anybody not? You want me to explain? Are you all good on that? Okay. So we in fact probably did more DACAs than any organization in the state when it first came out. And we're kind of known for doing our Daca work. And part of that's because we've used volunteers so effectively. It's been kind of what we're known for. So we're continuing to do that work. We do temporary protected status, and that's, again, temporary protected status is usually is offered by a State Department or now DHS declaration that there's been some disaster in another country. So El Salvador were two major earthquakes, I believe, in 2001. So if you were here from El Salvador when that happened, you could apply for temporary protected status, which would give you the right to stay for a 2-year period with a work permit, work legally. That has been renewed since 2001. So now you have folks from El Salvador who've been here for 20 years, legally, according to this rule. And one of the things the Trump administration tried to do was to terminate that. So his administration determined that the conditions were right to go back to El Salvador. And again, there was much argument about this. Probably conditions from those earthquakes had changed enough, but conditions in terms of the quality of life in El Salvador have deteriorated in other ways. So politically, it's been allowed to continue. Trump's administration challenged that. It's been held up in court. But those folks have to renew their work permit every 18 to 24 months. So we do that. We do a lot of work with domestic violence victims, the VAWA Act that I mentioned earlier, and U visas. We're doing more trafficking visas. Folks who have been victims of trafficking are eligible, and particularly U visas and T visas, if they have to cooperate or they have to work with the police on some of these things, and that allows them then to get status. We do a little bit of asylum work. We don't do a whole lot of it because it's very intensive, and for every asylum case we take, that's probably 10 to 15 other cases we can't do because they're just so intensive in the amount of work. We do a little bit of work with detained folks, but right now we don't have a lot of resources dedicated to that because, again, it's very different than the more transactional work that we've historically done. So I would say probably 70% of our clients have been victims of crime in some way, shape, or form, and their pathway to documentation could be because they've been a victim of crime. Or it could just be, they may have a pathway to documentation through Daca, but they've also been victims of crime. So that's typically who our clients are. We're serving about 750 clients a year. We have been trying to increase that. We've added more attorneys. The challenge is it's taking so much longer to process because of all of the changes, quite frankly, from the Trump administration, literally changing the rules on applications on a daily basis. And the length of time it takes to process those cases on the government side, throw the pandemic on top of that, where we're meeting remotely with clients and we're having to use mail. And you've heard the stories of the US Post Office, having forms go back and forth and so forth. Everything's taking longer. So while we've increased our capacity from an attorney standpoint, it's taking so much longer to process cases that we haven't had the growth in the total number of clients that we would like to see and we hope to get to over time. But of those 750 clients, it's over 1,000 cases because some of them have multiple cases that we have to do. Many of them are, because of their case type, are also able to apply for their family members. So those are all each separate cases as well. So that's most of our work. In terms of, the outcomes, quite frankly, we're successful on probably 99% of those that we apply for. Now, I have to caveat that in that we don't apply for cases for someone who doesn't have a very good chance of winning. And partly because you actually probably put them in more danger if you say, hey, go for it. Now, if a client wants to pursue that, we certainly will. But we work and are very realistic with clients about what the likelihood is that they're going to be successful at that. The exception to that success rate is really asylum. Probably less than 20% of asylum cases ever get approved. And quite frankly, it's probably, depending on your jurisdiction, and in Virginia is not nearly as, like, if you're in Atlanta, it's probably 2%. Virginia, and again, this is the judicial, rulings on this stuff. It's probably a little bit higher. Folks who are applying for asylum without representation have a very, very low chance of actually succeeding. But asylum as a whole probably is only successful in maybe somewhere between 10 and 15% of the time because of the level of complexity on that. So those, I would tell you, we obviously are not, not successful on as high a rate as we are on the more transactional cases.
Erin?
And how do clients come to you? How do they find you?
We in Northern Virginia, we've been here for 25 years, so we've built our reputation. We work very closely with social workers, with the police. with faith communities, and the schools, and and clients share it as well. So if they know we're a trustworthy organization, word gets out. We also work very closely with our peer group, the other immigration legal service providers in the area. And none of us have the capacity, even collectively, to serve the demand. So we all refer to each other as well, because we're the ones who are not fee dependent. As I mentioned, we typically charge $100 for most of our cases. It's a consultation fee. We waive that half the time because our clients are in that below 200% of poverty level. Most of the other nonprofits are on a sliding scale. So depending on the income and the case type, they're charging some fees, and don't waive them, and refer to us if the folks can't afford them. So there's a lot of ways for clients to come in. Outside of Northern Virginia, this is part of our challenge, is having to really partner with organizations who already have the connections with the immigrant population. So we're working with a lot of churches who may have ministries like food ministry, or ESL organizations who are working with the immigrants in some way, and they've already built that trust and they see the demand. So we're trying to partner with them to say, hey, you can refer clients to us. And as we start to build that and get to be known in these other areas, then we'll start to build up clients here. We are only able to serve probably 25% of the people who call us, and that's purely a capacity issue. So we have no problems getting clients. We just don't have enough help to be able to serve them all. Scott, you had something?
Yeah. First, I want to just thank you for the work that you're doing and for that presentation, which was, I know, just giving us a sort of a tip of the complexity, and it was complex enough with just the tip. And I also was reminded of how much we can barely begin to imagine the kind of constant fear that folks just live with on a daily basis in these kinds of situations. And I was wondering if you've alluded to this a couple of times about ways that congregations partner with you all, things that particularly, a congregation like Lewinsville, which is, I don't know what our attorney per capita quotient is. I think as a congregation, we're probably pretty high on that, but not, a lot of us are not legally trained, just different ways that congregations connect with and partner with you all.
Absolutely. I mentioned a lot of the volunteer work we do, and it's for both attorneys and non-attorneys. So our process is, first of all of our phone calls are answered by volunteers. So we use a lot of college interns on a semester basis, but we also have folks who are long-term volunteers who, particularly if they're bilingual, usually Spanish, probably 70% of our clients speak Spanish, but we also have a lot of English speaking and other languages. But we usually, again, everything's a little off because of the pandemic. Normally we have 2 to 3 people in our office Tuesday through Friday, 9 to 5, answering phones. And we do an initial screening intake that helps us determine whether we're going to be able to serve that client or not. So that's all volunteers. Again, non-pandemic, we also use volunteers. They do not have to be attorneys to help with the next level of intake. And we typically do this through clinics. So the way a clinic works is we will schedule anywhere from 4 to 10 clients to come in at one time. And we use 2 volunteers per client. And because all of this, because it's government, is a lot of paperwork. So we do an initiative that when somebody wants to be a client, they call in, we've got about a 10-minute interview process that we gather enough data to say, do they meet our income level? Is it a case type we handle? We look and see if we have capacity. If we can't help them, we give them referrals to potential other resources of help. If we can help them, we'll schedule them for an appointment. They get scheduled for a clinic, they come in, we train volunteers to do the next level of detailed screening. So this is gathering really the detailed information that the attorneys need to fully understand if and what pathway a client might have. So they get into much more detail about the client's story. And we do these clinics. So if we have 10 clients come in, we'll have 20 volunteers. You come in a half an hour before, we train you. And you will actually sit down with the client and you will complete this next level of screening documents. Then you come back to the attorney with the documents, and the attorney will say, okay, we'll look at this. We need to find out more about this, or yes, this is what we thought from the pre-screening. Here's the next set of forms, and you go back in. So the attorneys don't have to sit and do all of that paperwork, but are providing the supervision. And it's really an efficient way to be able to serve a lot of clients with less attorneys. So we'll have maybe 3 attorneys for 10 clients in a 2 to 3 hour period. With the Daca work right now, we have a couple volunteers in twice a week, and they're reviewing all of the documentation. For Daca, you have to prove you've been in the country since 2012, and you have to document like on a month-by-month basis. So they're actually, I mean, if you can imagine the amount of paper this is. So we have volunteers who are literally reviewing to make sure they have the documentation for every month. So we use volunteers for all those kinds of things. We also use volunteers for outreach. Again, in a non-pandemic world, when there's community fairs and events like that, we often have a table or have a presence, and we can't be at everything. So we use volunteers to help represent us in those kinds of things. Fundraising is always, always, always needed. And, you know, so if as a congregation you wanted to do a fundraiser or, you know, something like that, that's another way that folks can help. We love to have a lot of volunteers. And again, it's been really hard. I mean, we have other volunteer opportunities. If you like to do data entry, if you like to just do filing, there's plenty of English speaking opportunities as well. But there's just a lot of ways. And if individuals want to get involved, you can go on our website. There's a volunteer application that our volunteer attorney or our volunteer coordinator will review, will contact you about, and, you know, try to see where the fit is. And hopefully soon, as you get vaccines and we get vaccines and we can start to kind of rebuild that actively, we'll do that. Attorneys, to go just a little further, attorneys can do any of that. You do not have to be an immigration attorney, but we also have what we call volunteer attorneys. And our volunteer attorney, we do some pro bono work where we'll actually place cases with law firms, but we tend to use volunteer attorneys. And usually it could be a retired attorney, or we have some moms who decided to stay home who are attorneys who are wanting to keep their foot in the game. And we train. We're very process oriented. So we actually have processes for every single case type. And so we ask volunteers to keep office hours. It's usually like at least 8 hours a week. So it is a commitment if you want to do this, but you would actually be working under the supervision of one of our staff attorneys. And so you would have instructions on how to handle a case, but you'd also have the staff attorney's support. They will actually sign off on the case. A volunteer attorney does not. So our staff attorney owns the case. But basically, our volunteer attorneys can do anywhere from 60 to 99% of the case, depending on the attorney and the case type, under the supervision of the staff attorney. So again, it just expands the ability of our attorneys to be able to help that many more people. So lots of ways.
Rosalind, could you tell us a little bit about what you did when you volunteered?
You need to unmute, Rosalind.
Well, I worked there over 2 different times and 2 different years. I had to stop because of physical limitations, both Paul's and mine. And first of all, it was a joy to be there. And I was pleased to be able to interview prospective clients. I worked on the phones. I didn't speak Spanish, so I was limited in that regard, because a lot of people that call in need a Spanish speaker. But, and I did anything anybody asked me to do. I filed, I did some typing, I did some stuff in the computer, entered data. I just tried to be a whatever was needed when I was there, I did.
And that's, yeah, I mean, we are so blessed by our volunteers, because it just, and we're talking, you know, seriously, the pandemic, things are piling up like you would not believe. One of the things that we do is, once our clients' cases are closed for 5 years, we actually scan the paper documents so that we have an electronic copy, and we shred the old one because we don't have enough filing space for all of these, as you can imagine. We're about 2 years behind in that project. So if you like to scan, we can use your help. Plus, when we merged with Maryland, we got all of their case stuff. So we've got a lot of scanning work to catch up on. There's always administrative type things to do. And those are the things that, quite frankly, when we're shorthanded, can tend to fall behind. I spent a half day, I don't know, a few months ago, just filing files because the attorneys would finish them and they'd stack them there. And we didn't have anybody else to file them. So I'm going to do that today. It's actually kind of fun to do some other stuff, but it's a challenge. And we're just really blessed with the work that Rosalind and so many of our volunteers do.
Are you in a position yet to be able to accept volunteers who have been fully vaccinated to help you deal with some of that backlog?
Yeah, I think we can. We are still, our office is such that for any of the staff that's in, we're all in our individual offices. We have protocols for the office. A number of us have been able to go ahead and get shots. We're very fortunate with that. So we wear masks if we're not in our office, or if there's, if 2 people are in the same room, we're wearing masks. We have some air filters. We have screens between places in the front office. So we put as many protections in. So yeah, we could use some help, and there's probably some days that there's fewer people in than others, that if you've been vaccinated and you want to do that, you can let us know and we can try to work it out.
So go through the application process?
Yeah, and if you want, you can just say, talk to Erin on the Lewinsville presentation, and I'll make sure that Saskia, who's our volunteer coordinator, knows that. And yeah, and we can, we might pick certain days because of the number of people in at any given time, just so that we can kind of manage all of that.
Erin, I had a question. You'd mentioned briefly mixed status families, and for background, I'm a professor at George Mason University. So we have lots of Daca students.
Yep.
Occasional, student who says, I get things like, I have to go see my father in detention because I'm the only member of the family who can do that without elaboration, which I think probably means I'm the youngest member of the family. I'm a citizen, nobody else is,
Right.
Or I have Daca and my older siblings don't, or whatever, or as well as the language issue probably. So I just wonder if you could talk about sort of what you see from client stories about how that affects.
Well, yeah, probably the most blatant thing has been with the pandemic. The stimulus checks, for example, mixed families, the first one, mixed families did not get a stimulus check. So even US citizens in a mixed family, if they have one person who was undocumented, they did, or, and filed taxes with a TIN as opposed to a Social Security number, they were not eligible to get the stimulus. So it's had a huge impact on them from that angle. Public charge, which is, again, one of the things that came out of the Trump administration, that basically said, if there's any chance you ever will be dependent on the government for anything, we can deny you the ability to get status, even if you have, by definition, a pathway. So what that has caused many folks to do is not accept benefits for their US citizen children, for example, who may be eligible for Medicaid and those kind of things. They're afraid to apply for it because they think it may impact their ability to get status later on. So there's a lot of issues like that. The fear factor is probably the biggest thing. I've heard stories of the 6-year-olds being sent across the road to go to the grocery store because the undocumented parent is afraid to do that. You know, it's heartbreaking, some of these things. And, you know, it's the detention piece is the, you know, somebody gets picked up in the family and there's not a lot of good information, and it may be the breadwinner that gets picked up. So then you've got other, you know, there's lots and lots of implications, but there are many mixed status families from U.S. citizen to undocumented, and it has huge impacts. What we see in our results is that once people get documented, their income goes up by 25% almost instantly. So, you know, you see the impact of being able to work legally. They're working. They're often victims of they get taken advantage of because, you know, down here in the corner of my office, it's a big day labor pickup. I know these guys get ripped off all the time because you hire them and they'll say, I'll pay you 10 or 20 bucks an hour. And then I don't have to pay you. What are you going to do? You're going to go to the police? And that happens way more than anybody wants to acknowledge. So there's a lot of issues, but the trauma piece, quite frankly, I think, unfortunately, I think we're going to have a generation of immigrants with PTSD from some of the things that the fear factor, particularly the last 4 years that they've experienced, I think has done a lot of harm to many of these folks who are, by all intents and purposes, good citizens. You know, they want to work. They're trying to support their families. They're not getting public benefits. They're not eligible for public benefits. So they're not. There's a lot of false information about that. You know, they've left desperate situations that you and I would do the same thing to take care of our family. I got to spend a week in El Salvador a year and a half ago, just kind of learning about a lot of stuff. It's a beautiful country, and you kind of look at it and you go, why? What is going on? But we heard story after story about by the time a boy is about 9 or 10 years old, they have to decide which gang they're going to be in. It's not if you're going to be in the gang, it's which one you're going to be in. And if you have a problem with the gang in one area and you try to relocate into another part of the country, it's the size of Massachusetts, the whole country. There's no getting away from it. So that's why you see so many families bringing their kids, just trying to give them a chance to not have to make those choices. And I don't know the answer on how you fix things there. But, you know, I think that's an important part of what this Citizenship Act is looking at, is to make sure that we are trying to look at what's driving people from these countries. What, you know, how can we help them find ways to improve things there, economically and so forth? Because, you know, when you have no hope, it basically comes down to, there's nothing else I can do here. So they flee. And basically we've got to work with these countries to try to figure out how to restore hope in their population, so that most people don't want to leave where they're from. You know, it's scary to come to this country. You're not treated particularly well. You can be shunned. You don't know the language. You don't know the rules. And, you know, it's tough. It's very brave for, you know, what these folks are choosing to do. Rosalind?
I have huge presentation. I think you ought to tell people that you're a 501c3 organization and that you gratefully accept donations. And you
I don't even have to say that now.
Maybe want to discuss where your funding comes from, because it's obvious that $100 per client that's generally waived isn't paying your lawyers.
Yeah, no. We're blessed. About a third of our funding comes from county and state grants, the largest being Fairfax County. We have a grant from Arlington County, from the state of Virginia, and from Montgomery County. The Virginia one looks like it may be going away. We have about a third of our funding from private foundations. that provide grants. And then about a third of our funding comes from individual donors. And what that gives us is a lot of flexibility to be able to respond to the demands as they come in, because some of our grants, the government grants in particular, have requirements for how many and the type of cases that we do. And it's not highly restrictive. We have a fair amount of flexibility in it, but there's definitely obligations with that. If conditions change, we still have to meet those obligations, where usually with private foundations or for individual donations that are unrestricted, then we have the flexibility to do the things that we need to do. So, as I mentioned, we're only able to take 25 to 30% of the folks who call us for help, and that is purely capacity. We have grown significantly. When I started almost 5 years ago, we had 3 attorneys. We now have 9, 3 of which are part-time. And we've definitely increased, but not as much as you would like, because we're doing harder cases. All case types are taking longer. And so, we hope that things start to ramp up a little bit faster too, and being able to do things faster. But it probably costs us overall between $1,000 and $1,500 per client, depending on the case type. And as Russell pointed out, we typically charge $100.
Sorry.
It's also why our volunteers are so valuable, because they really help us stretch those dollars significantly.
And it sounds like you can take volunteers of all ages and.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Do people need to be over 18 or?
Yes, they do need to be over 18. And especially if you're dealing with clients, you have to, we deal with a lot of secondary trauma. And even on the calls coming in that Rosalind talked about, the intake is not designed to get to that level of detail, but clients often start telling their story. And the hard part of that job is we're telling 3 out of 4 of them that we're not going to be able to help them. We have to call them back and say, we really can't help you. Here's some other places you can call. So it's hard work in that sense. And then if you're doing the next level of intake, you are hearing the details of these stories, and they're tough. They're heart-wrenching. The outcomes, if we're able to help them, are joyful. I mean, it's so exciting when somebody comes by to pick up their green card. You heard Rodrigo in the video. He's, by the way, now on our board. He is a legislative aide to Kathy Tran, who's one of our Virginia state delegates. And we see so many folks like that, particularly our Daca client, who are these young, bright, for all intents and purposes, Americans. This is the only really what they know. They're just having to navigate the system. And but it can be tough. You have, if you're going to deal with the client stories, you got to know that you're going to hear some really tough things. And we try, part of the reason we do those group lunches is it's a chance to kind of to just take a break and to decompress a bit, and helps us all get to know each other better. And we try to have things in place for the attorneys and for the volunteers, so that if you're having a tough time with it, stop. Give yourself a break, because this is tough work.
Can imagine. Well, I think you have also, I'm going to switch hats and say you have somewhat given us a bit of a teaser for what we're going to be doing in our Lenten Studies series this year. We have somebody talking about trauma, Denise Hopkins of Wesley, talking about trauma in the Old Testament, actually, but still, I think the sense that trauma is something that is dealt with in the Bible is still with us today. It is a lens through which we're increasingly understanding a number of different experiences: the immigrant experience, the experience of being Black in America, many different experiences. So I think that's a useful reminder and a nice way that things are sort of tying together, maybe by the leading of the Spirit, since we didn't do it deliberately. But are there other questions people would like to ask or issues they would like to raise? I think if Scott, do you want to?
I was just going to express again appreciation, Aaron. Yeah.
I think this is very helpful in understanding. We have joined what the Presbyterian Church has something called the Matthew 25 initiative, which deals with dismantling structural racism, addressing systemic poverty. Does not specifically mention immigration, but obviously both of those, are very much tied up in those two issues.
Yeah, I will tell you, there have been a number of studies in the medical arena that immigration status is one of the largest social determinants of health, and is very much, we're working with Kaiser and other healthcare providers because they're seeing so much the impact of this on the healthcare for the community as a whole, and it is impacting, and it's I mean, I can tell stories of, you hear the stories of being pulled over for driving while Black. We're also seeing that being pulled over while driving while Hispanic, and the implications of all of those things. So it's tough. Yeah.
Right.
Since we have 8 minutes left, I'm retired from a career in international development with USAID, World Bank, and this wouldn't be the kind of thing that you focus on as a legal agency, but I'm wondering whether you read about or have some ideas about how U.S. policy, you talked about U.S. policy having some impact on making things unlivable in some of these countries. In the area of development and poverty and so forth, is that the kind of thing that you feel that you have enough information about that you could say something?
Probably not enough. All I can tell you, my experience with part of the trip to El Salvador was to learn some of that. And, what I learned was, we went through a period where anything labeled communist was fair game for being, anti-American, and was often, in the Central American countries, we were basically fighting communism. And what it often wasn't literally communism, but it was truly the poor uprising to say, we need help. And, you had some less than quality governments that were partnered with the United States that labeled stopping communism. And so we're literally killing people. Father Romero of the nuns, and some of those stories were the things that we actually studied while we were there. And it was rather eye-opening to learn that. I do not claim to be an expert to this, but part of the discussion that the Salvadorans were sharing with us is that, we've been sending like $1 million in arms to El Salvador for years. And, in an effort to fight communism. And what we've effectively done and trained people, we basically trained these guerrilla forces who have become these gangs and everything else that are now controlling the governments and controlling the streets and everything else. So I am not an expert on it. I don't proclaim to know much more than what I've just shared with you on that, but it was eye-opening to learn. That's not something that gets put in our history books about America's helping some of these countries. And it always scares me when we talk about trying to go fix things in other places, because we've not been particularly successful in doing a lot of that work. But I think we've got to continue to work and find ways to work with these countries and help build economic. The biggest issue is, the underlying issue in all this is economic stability. If you can't feed your family, it's tough. And we've had policies that, I've been to Haiti several times. I've never seen anything in the world as bad as Haiti, just to drive through some of these places. Our the way we subsidize our rice, it was cheap. You know, they quit growing their own rice because it was cheaper to buy rice from America. And so they all moved to the cities, and, you know, they don't have an infrastructure because of a lot of those kinds of things. So again, I don't proclaim to know all of the answers on this, but we have a lot of policies that help the United States, but do damage to other places and don't always realize the implications of that. And the effect is then ultimately these folks are so desperate that they want to come someplace where the economics are better. So you, with your experience, what's your take on that?
Well, my experience was mostly in Africa, but I wish Phil Church, one of our Lewinsville members, Phil Church, was also a USAID retiree and worked primarily in Latin America. So yeah, he knows a lot about this issue. A lot of it has to do with you did mention something of the subsidies in the United States, which help, at least in the short run, help American farmers, but then they create disincentives to agriculture in these Central American countries.
Right.
And somehow our political system and our level of understanding has not gotten to the point where we realize, and our legislators realize, and voters realize that we're shooting our own foot, essentially.
Yeah. I think that was one of the big eye openers for me, doing that immersion experience in El Salvador was we are so blind to what our internal policies, the effect it has outside the United States, because our focus is, well, it helps the farmers here. That's all we really care about. That's who's electing our officials, takes care of them. But there are much greater implications to those policies that most of us don't understand.
Yeah.
So taking a more global perspective, and that is certainly something, not only do we have many people who have worked in that realm, but I think that's an area in which some sort of, aid abroad, a number of the rising generation are into, including Ray's family. So that continues to be something that Lewinsville members can be aware of and sort of thinking of as we go out and try to help, but be aware of the larger picture sometimes too, which is a complication. So I think I will say thank you so much for joining us, and thank you for allowing us to record this, which I think I know Phil and Connie are dealing with a family death in progress. So I think they will want to watch, and I've heard from some others. So this will be of use to a number of people, and we really very much appreciate learning more about your work and the work of Just Neighbors in general, and the opportunities for volunteers. And we'll look forward to partnering further.
Absolutely. And I would extend the offer is if some point down the road you'd like to have that Immigration 101 and really do the detail, we can certainly offer to do that. It's an excellent presentation, and all of our attorneys do a great job with it. And it's interactive. You get to ask a ton of questions, and you'll just go, what? Do a lot of it. It's actually kind of fun to watch people's jaws drop when they understand some of these rules. So
that sounds very useful too, and I think a possibility we should explore. So
just let me know.
I think that would be very, very helpful, because most of us, have no contact with this whole system, and just don't realize not only how complex and bizarre it is, but how much the odds are stacked against, really good people.
Right. Exactly.
Well, thank you very, very much. And we appreciate your spending part of your Saturday morning with us. We appreciate everybody spending part of their Saturday morning with us.
Absolutely.
And we will look forward to further partnerships. So thank you.
Thank you so much. Take care.